Hello, this is Defunct City, and today we are going to talk about a story that took place in the south of Austria, not far from the city of Graz. On July 23rd of the year 2019, on a warm and sunny July day, 27-year-old triathlete Natalie decided to go for a bike ride. The girl was getting in shape after the birth of her son, who was now 3 months old. Despite her recent pregnancy, the girl tried to get out for such workouts as often as possible, and she replaced car rides with walking whenever possible. Natalie had long been a triathlete, often winning prizes in youth competitions. All her friends and relatives knew her as an active, kind girl with strong willpower and a sharp mind. During her training, the girl often traveled out of town, and this time was no exception. The countryside offered great scenery that gave her strength and a second wind. That was why Natalie loved to go for a drive there. She had become so used to the passing cars that she no longer paid attention to them. That was why she was not immediately alerted to a red car approaching slowly from behind. Suddenly the driver sped up and, on the same level with the bicycle, hit her so that Natalie flew off the road and fell to the ground. The stunned girl, seeing that the car had stopped, thought it was an accident. The driver was distracted and accidentally hit her. So, by all means, help her and take her to the hospital, or at least call an ambulance. That would be very helpful. After all, her arm and head hurt terribly. But what happened next was not what Natalie had expected. The man got out of the car, opened the trunk, took out a long stick, and quickly, walking over to the girl, began beating her, hitting her in the head and on the body with such hard blows. The girl lost consciousness, and the unknown man dragged her into the car, tied her hands and feet, blindfolded her, and went to get her bicycle, which he stuffed into the trunk. Then he got behind the wheel and calmly drove on. Natalie was in shock. Consciousness came back and then slipped away again, which was no surprise. The blows were so hard that one of them, hitting the unprotected part of her helmeted head, nearly fractured her skull, leaving a crack. In those moments when Natalie came to, she was able to see where she was through a small slit in her blindfold. She was lying in the backseat of the car. There was a man behind the wheel, but she could only make out his silhouette. Her eyes were blurry, and every movement caused intense pain. There was a lot of trash in the interior of the car, dried leaves of fast food packaging. Natalie tried to lie still and see as much as she could, hoping her gaze would catch on some sign of a small thing that would help her survive and see her son again. Fear forced her to look for a way out, the possibility of escape, but the pain kept her from focusing. When they stopped, Natalie was unconscious. The man got her out of the car and dragged her into the house, where she slowly began to regain consciousness. Once inside, he put her in a closet, closed it, and left, without saying anything. Now the girl was alone in the dark closet, with a broken arm and a serious head injury. But in spite of everything, she kept thinking how to get out. Natalie couldn't figure out who this man was and why or what he was doing all this to her. What awaited her next? Would he torture her? Or would he just leave her there and forget about her? It was important for her to understand that the fear of responsibility from the accident was driving his actions. Lust, desire for revenge for something, or maybe all at once. The reflection was interrupted by another blur. She fainted again and again. When she woke up again, she realized that she was no longer locked in the dark closet. Natalie was lying on the bed, also tied up, but now completely naked. She looked around at once, wondering where she was and what to do next. Her hands were tied in front of her body, which gave her a chance to fight back if she had to. Through the large window there was a bright light, cutting her eyes in her condition, which allowed her to see her surroundings. Natalie assumed that only a few hours had passed since her abduction. After all, she had been attacked at about 17 o'clock, and the sun was shining very brightly. So it probably hadn't been more than 3 or 4 hours. The room was as filthy as the car. Clothes, food packages, and dirty dishes were lying everywhere. The only thing that stood out in this mess was a window. on which pots of beautiful orchids were carefully arranged. It was obvious that the owner of the house had taken care of them. The rest of the room was a real chaos of clothes and crockery, and there was nothing in it that could give any information about the kidnapper or where she was. Trying to free her hands, Natalie felt very dizzy. Her eyes went black. Her strength quickly melted away and the girl lost consciousness again. When Natalie regained consciousness once more, it was already dark outside the window. True, this time she had no time to free herself. After a couple of minutes she heard someone coming up the stairs, and then she saw her captor. He was holding a bottle of wine, which he placed on the table, and then spoke to her for the first time. The man offered to have a drink together and socialize, to discuss everything that had happened, and to get to know each other at the same time. When Natalie refused to drink, he forced wine into her mouth. When he realized that nothing was working, he threw the bottle away and taped her mouth again. Before the man left the room, he said a phrase that did not go through Natalie's head. "I just wanted to have a drink with you and get to know you and then go out on a date. You don't have to be so hard on yourself. An acquaintance like that certainly wouldn't end up being a date." But these words gave the girl hope that she would still survive the day and be able to see her family again. That's not the kind of thing a normal person would do just to get acquainted, which means he clearly has a mental disorder, if not more than one. If she is correct in her assumptions, then everything she says now needs to be thought over several times. For now any word could both save her and lead to tragic consequences. Natalie's goal now was not to escape, but to survive. By all means, it was necessary to arouse pity in her captor or find the right words to make him trust her. Anyway, the abnormal rendezvous continued, and after wine the kidnapper decided to feed his guest. Perhaps there was no other food in the house, or maybe the man had chosen such an unusual dish on purpose. But he decided to feed her cat food. Natalie ate through the strength of what her captor gave her. The food was obviously not fresh, and the fact that the man had decided to heat it up made its taste and smell simply unbearable. But the girl, though with difficulty, still ate spoonful after spoonful. The fact that her captor had promised to let her go in the morning gave her strength. If she did everything he told her to do, she would just have to get through the day, and tomorrow she would be free. Natalie's thoughts on her possible freedom were interrupted by the sound of water. It was the filling of the bathroom meant for her. The kidnapper untied the girl's legs and led her into the bathroom, telling her to get in. Natalie immediately obediently prepared to get into it, but the water was simply icy, which made her reflexively remove her foot, saying that the water was very cold. This simple phrase immediately infuriated the man, who had been acting very calm just a few seconds before. He grabbed the girl by the hair, knelt down, pressed her upper body over the water, and began to drown her. No matter how hard Natalie tried to break free, the forces were unequal. Every second under the water seemed to last an eternity, and from the struggle and panic she was losing a lot of air. Natalie was a good athlete, a great swimmer, and could hold her air for a long time, but not everyone can remain calm and in control in such a situation. Even though it took time, Natalie was able to calm down and stop wasting vital air. She endured and waited, offering no resistance in the hope that then she would be let go. And then, at a moment when there was no more air left and no more strength to fight for life, her captor let her go. After that, Natalie's hopes of salvation practically vanished. She was alone, helpless, with many injuries, no clothes, and practically no strength. It all seemed like a terrible nightmare about to end. She would wake up and be with her son in his bed. She no longer hoped anyone would be able to find her and save her. She just wanted to survive. To go home and forget about it. What Natalie didn't know was that they had been looking for her all over town and the neighborhood for hours after she hadn't returned home. Her husband became alarmed and, unable to reach her, immediately contacted the police. A large-scale search ensued. At first it involved only a few police officers, relatives and friends who were also into triathlons. The number of volunteers in the search quickly increased, and by that point, Natalie was looking for over 200 people. A helicopter with a thermal imaging camera was even involved in the search. But the main version of her disappearance was that she was in an accident or had fallen into a pit, accidentally drove off the road, and now could not get out. The possibility that the girl had been kidnapped was only considered after thoroughly investigating all her usual routes. The search continued, but, of course, finding one girl in a huge number of houses without any leads was practically impossible. Meanwhile, Natalie's situation was getting worse. The kidnapper tied her up again, dragged her into the basement, where he tied her to a chair. There was no way to look around. The cellar was very dark and cold, and she didn't have time to see anything, for the angry man attacked her again in just a few seconds. He grabbed Natalie by the hair and pressed some scarf tightly against her face from trying to inhale. A pungent chemical odor hit her nose, which made her begin to faint. Only this time Natalie didn't panic. She held her breath and waited, hoping her tormentor would surrender first. And so it turned out. This time the man's patience ran out before Natalie's air. Furious at his inability to understand why his victim was still conscious, he threw away the rag, untied her from the chair, and dragged her out of the cellar. The man dragged her past the bathroom into the bedroom, where he dumped her on the bed again and left. Natalie lay trembling with fear and anticipation of what would happen next. But then something happened that she had long feared would happen. The unknown man returned and began to undress, then lay down next to her on the bed, moving closer and closer. Natalie froze in terror and helplessness, barely breathed. All she wanted was for this to turn out to be just a scary dream. But she knew it was real, and there was nothing she could do. Quickly running through the options in her head, the girl was already ready for anything, as long as they let her go then, and she went back to her son. And at a moment when it seemed that nothing could be done and no words would help, her eyes fell on those very orchids. The only thing in this house that stood out was their care and care. With a last hope, she squeezed out the decisive words. "What beautiful orchids!" Freezing, waiting for reaction, Natalie waited. She waited for her words to help her captor talk, and for him to show pity. And she was right. After these words the man began to talk to her. He told her that he was a gardener and that he really liked taking care of flowers, buying the best fertilizer and watering them with water from the aquarium so that they would grow better. Natalie, holding back tears, listened to him and praised the way he cared, and the man continued to talk. He talked about how his girlfriend had recently dumped him and how he was worried and angry about it. He said that his alcoholic mother had never shown any love or care for him. He also talked about his father, whom he had never seen, and about his grandparents who had raised him. Natalie continued through her tears to praise and pity him, telling him that everything could still be fixed and a new life could begin. When the man had completely calmed down and talked it out, she took a risky step. She offered to help him make new friends and find a girlfriend. But in order to do that, she had to let her go. Natalie suggested she pretend nothing had happened, to tell everyone that he didn't kidnap her, but rather that he saved her. After she accidentally hit a deer and drove off the road, injuring her arm and head. Outside the window, the sound of a flying helicopter was heard growing stronger and stronger, and the girl was afraid that it would scare the kidnapper and he would refuse. So, seeing his doubts, she offered to go out with him when things calmed down and she came to her senses. But then something happened that Natalie no longer had much hope for. The kidnapper got up, got dressed, and brought her things. And believing her eyes. Despite the pain, Natalie began to dress quickly with apprehension, glancing at the door. She needed to get out of this house as quickly as possible before the kidnapper changed his mind. Before she left, he chatted to her as if they were old friends, put his number in her phone, and asked her to write her own. She wrote and even added on the paper, "With love, Natalie." The door opened and the girl felt the fresh air, barely restrained herself from trying to escape. She pulled herself together and walked to the car with a smile on her face, realizing that in this state she would not be able to escape. Whatever the fear of the unknown, riding in the car was better than being tied up. It was comforting to know that her kidnapper had taken her bicycle out of the garage and put it in the trunk. Maybe he was really going to take her home. Her heart pounded with terrible strength. But Natalie kept smiling and talking. In the conversation, she heard her traveling companion's name for the first time. Christophe, a common name she would remember for the rest of her life if she made it home. At one point, as they drove past the cemetery, the car began to slow down at the thought that this was the final stop, and her heart went in her heels. But Christophe only turned on the air conditioner, asking if she was too hot. Natalie was in a cold sweat with fear, but she kept smiling and said she was fine. After a while they finally pulled up in front of her house, and the girl immediately jumped out of the car and ran to the door. Fortunately, her mother-in-law was at home watching her son while her husband was out searching. She immediately closed the door, told her mother-in-law to close all the windows, and ran to her son's room. Meanwhile, Christophe quietly unloaded the bike, left it at the door, and left for home, where he lit a dinner and went to bed, apparently anticipating the coming changes in his life and new friends. And the changes were indeed not long in coming. Natalie immediately told her husband, and he and the police were back at the house within minutes. From the data on the computer on the bike, the police were able to determine the route of their journey and quickly arrest the suspect. At 3 a.m., Cobra SWAT apprehended Christophe in his own home. He was soon charged, but more about that later. Natalie took a long time to recover. Her wounds had healed, her bones had healed, but psychologically she had been unable to recover for a long time. 4 months after her abduction, she was finally able to return to a normal life. She rejoices in every minute she spends with her son and husband and tries to forget this tragic story, but the fear still remains. Natalie hired a nanny for the baby, though she tries not to leave the baby for long periods of time. She says she is afraid to be home alone when her husband is at work, but now she always has someone to talk to distract her from her memories, and that makes it much easier. Now her house is always full of guests, close friends and relatives who have helped her to recover all this time. The only constant reminder of what happened were the journalists who kept calling and waiting at the door, hoping to get the details of that day from her, or to take another picture. Over time, she came to realize that the only way to put it behind her was not to forget what had happened, but to accept it. To accept and live with it. Moving forward, together with her son and husband, who would always be her support and encouragement. But it was not only her family that became her lifeline. Her favorite job also added to her strength. Natalie became a professional trainer and now helps other athletes with their training. But she has not given up on her own training. Every day she goes for another run to keep up with her students and set the right example. This helps clear her head of thoughts and focus. The bicycle, however, is still in the garage. On March 5, 2020, Christophe was on trial. The defendant was diagnosed with a mental disorder, which, according to the experts, still did not prevent him from understanding what he had done. He was also found to have mental retardation. During the questioning and in court, Christophe gave automatic, nonchalant answers to all the questions. He gave the impression that he was talking to a robot. Although the prosecutor argued in every conceivable way that the defendant had no intention of keeping Natalie alive, and that saving her could be likened to running away, the lawyer was able to soften the jury by citing the suspect's retardation and mental illness. The jury sentenced Christophe to 7 years imprisonment and a year of compulsory treatment in a specialized institution, and ordered him to pay 15,000 euros for moral damages. See you on the Defunct City soon.